Why? You recorded that. Oh. Yeah, that needs to be you.
Commercial people here, and they're very familiar with that term. They've heard about it. If you've been around for a while, you've heard about it for decades. And it's something that kind of got my career started at Rutgers in the mid 1990s. I was hired to work with landscapers and turf managers promoting the IPM philosophy. And back then in the 90s, it was still relatively a new term and it was cutting edge somewhat. But and so what I would do is I would go to the those who were willing to cooperate. It was called a mentoring, IPM mentoring program. And I would go to their sites. Typically we choose about 15 landscape companies. And normally it was those people who were the applicators that would want to work with me to learn how to properly monitor the landscape and then determine what kind of decisions needed to be made based on treatment. And so, and what materials would be more appropriate for an IPM approach. So that's what I did for 7 years. And then that program was discontinued. And now today I work with predominantly nursery and greenhouse growers. It's not necessarily a mentoring program. It's more of just a monitoring service and an advisory consulting service that I provide now. So that's ever since 2002, that's what I've been doing at Rutgers. So that makes 20 years of doing that. So I've been with Rutgers since '95. So come here to Gloucester many times. And so it's good to be back again. Okay, well, let me get started. I know that this, as I was kind of mentioning when I walked in this morning, this is kind of a mixed group. And so it's not always easy because if you're, especially if you're new to this class, I know there's some veterans here, maybe more than one, and you're already familiar with this, but those of you who are just starting this class for the first time, this might be a new term to you, IPM, Integrated Pest Management. So I have to kind of start on the basics. So you guys, don't hesitate to make any comments to me because you got experience. You've been doing, maybe, I don't know what type of operations you have. How many of you actually do applications of insecticides or fungicides and so forth, herbicides, especially if you're a turf manager, which I think some of you are at least. You do a lot of herbicides, weed controls. So that's certainly part of IPM as well. So don't hesitate to interject, either your experiences or if you disagree with me, that's even better. So, all right. So let's make sure this works. Okay. And let's see, the screen went blank here. I just want to get rid of that got it sign, Mary. And, I don't have my own computer. I'll touch it. So, yeah. So we are being recorded. Be careful what I say. The last time I didn't know that people were listening, and there were occasional those who were not on mute, and I would hear this extraneous sounds. As I was saying, I thought the place was haunted. But okay. Well, I can get off this cover, so I can't even move it now. Okay. Should have tested it before I gave that introduction. Okay. We can go to the handout. I know all of you have it. So as I indicated here, the questions, don't hesitate. And remember, IPM is a philosophy, uh, integrated pest management. It's something that, a lot of my people I work with, the nursery and greenhouse, they don't necessarily fully embrace the whole concept. Many of them are I can understand this with greenhouse and nursery because they're selling plants and they really want to keep their thresholds really low. Landscape, we can go a little bit higher with our thresholds. Looks good now? Okay. All right. Okay, so it is a philosophy and it's not necessarily embraced by everybody. And there's different degrees to how much you do embrace it. And so it's not a black and white, it's a continuum. Some that are really go all out and try to be a purist as far as the IPM approach, and others maybe less so. Okay. And so that's the acronym, and that's what it actually stands for. The only one that's in bold is the correct one. There's been a lot of creative changes that some have attempted to make. There's actually a couple of them actually left. The one there, integrated plant management. I don't know, do we have any people here that would call themselves arborists? Any arborists? Nobody. Okay. Well, if you were an arborist, you wouldn't say IPM. You would say PHC, which stands for plant healthcare. And so, the focus is more on the plant and maybe less on the pest. And really, that's what it should be. We're trying to manage plants. Pests is a problem we have to deal with. But, a lot more than just the pests as well. There's a lot of abiotic cultural practices that I'll talk about as well. Right. So that's kind of a formal definition of what IPM stands for. It's a informed approach, which means that it's scientific and it's observational and it's an accumulation of knowledge. And based on that knowledge, you make decisions. And whether when you intervene, if there's a problem that needs some correction, do you go with cultural, biological, chemical approaches, or maybe all three, which is often the case. And I'll talk about those three approaches in more detail as we go along further. But it minimizes the negative health consequences as well as the environmental types of undesirable things that we want to avoid when we apply pesticides. Okay. I'll kind of start with a story that starting back well over 100 years ago, maybe at the turn of when we first moved into the 20th century, well over 100 years ago, they had the citrus industry in California that had established itself, but they did have a pest problem, and it's this pest that's white in color that's on the screen, and it's called the cottony cushion scale. I don't think I even have it listed there, but that is a type of a scale. It's a piercing, sucking insect. It was causing enough of a problem that economic losses were taking place with the citrus industry. And what they didn't have, back then, they didn't have a lot of insecticides that were available. And so what happened is that the United States Department of Agriculture went over to Australia, and they found this same pest, this cottony cushion scale, but they also found something else that was not present in North America, and that's a predator. It's called the Vidalia beetle. It's actually a type of lady beetle, or we call it lady bugs, but they're technically beetles because they have chewing mouth parts. That black and white colored beetle. And so that it was shown in Australia to be doing a good job of keeping that pest, that scale, under control. And so they made the attempt to bring it over, and it took a few years to do this in sufficient numbers and for them to build up where it was creating a very beneficial effect in the California area as well. And so that was an example of what we call classical biological control. It's where we go over to another part of the world, another continent typically, and we bring an organism that's there. It could be a fungus as well as maybe a beneficial insect, or usually the more common of ones that we bring over, and we release it. But that could be a gamble because sometimes undesirable side effects can take place, and so they make an attempt to determine what any negative effects that might occur before they actually bring it over and release it. But they determined that there was no real problem with this Vidalia beetle, And it worked. It was a success, and it created good suppression of the scale insect. And this went along for several decades, a few decades, and then after World War II, the petrochemical industry really began to develop, and DDT was becoming available and used by a lot more people. That's an insecticide. That's a chlorinated hydrocarbon. It works very well as an insecticide, but it kind of builds up in the environment, and it was determined builds up in our fatty tissues. But also, when they did use it, it did a great job of controlling the scale, because they said, well, the beetles don't completely control the scales. That's generally never going to take place with biocontrol, but they reduced it to a satisfactory level, but they even maybe wanted more, let's get it completely out of here. And they did do that with the DDT, and it worked, at least for a while. But guess what the DDT did to the Vidalia beetles? It wiped them out, yeah. And oftentimes the insecticides do a better job of killing the predators than the pests that were targeted. But then what happened, though, is that it wasn't well understood how resistance in insects takes place back 70 years ago, 75 years ago. And so they started using the DDT too much, and the same mode of action, which means it's the same method of killing a particular pest. It's the scale insect evolved, and it changed. What the pesticide actually did was force the scale to evolve in order to survive. And so I'll explain how resistance works a little bit later in this simplistic series of slides. But it didn't take long where this scale was maybe less than a decade. I know that. Maybe 5 years they started showing less control by the DDT with the scale, and to the point eventually where it really wasn't very beneficial anymore, or wasn't effective, and they stopped using it. Anyway, so they stopped using it, and they went back over to Australia, and they gathered up more of these Vidalia beetles, and they re-released it again, but they weren't applying the DDT, and they reestablished themselves. And even today, they're very much aware that they want to protect this beetle, because even today, if you would ask a citrus industry person or grower about this beetle, they'll say, oh yeah, it's very valuable, and we want to keep it. Because it doesn't eliminate it, but it really reduces the problem with the scale. So anyway, long story there. Sorry about that. So just remember that when we attempt to eradicate something in nature, it's often difficult, and there's a lot of cases where we attempt to do it and we eventually fail. Anyway, so we just remember when we use pesticides that 100% control is not necessary. Okay. And we only treat when we need to. That's kind of makes sense, common sense there. So, although I tell you, when I worked in the industry, I always tell stories about my history when I first started. Was just a few years after graduating from college, I started working as an arborist in 1980, and at that time, IPM was not really something, even though some of us had heard about it in the landscape industry at that point, it really wasn't something that was being done. So we did, to tell you the truth, for the most part, I worked for a company that at least the pest management division was a production orientated type of an approach, meaning that they just sprayed on a calendar basis when they would go to a client's. Usually they had a lot of residential clients, some commercial clients, but they would just simply spray down the entire landscape. There was no decision making being made. They weren't even really paying attention to what was there necessarily. And that was called a blanket calendar cover spray. And that was the approach that was commonly done, back over 40 years ago. And that started to change as we moved through the 80s. And so And actually, as I said, IPM had been around even before then. 1950s is when I think that term, or maybe it was the early 60s. I'm not sure the date when the IPM was first started, when that term was actually implemented. It was coined by entomologists, and they were the early leaders with the IPM approach, entomologists. And so that's why I'm kind of have an entomology bias when I give this talk for landscape, because that's really what I know best. So, all right. And that started not with landscape, but it was more row crop farming, traditional agriculture, where they started implementing IPM. Okay. But it's done in many different, practice in many different areas. I started with the landscape and turf personally. And now I'm involved with nursery and greenhouse. But, Rutgers has different programs. Just for an example, we have a vegetable IPM program. Rutgers has a fruit tree IPM program. We have a school IPM program at Rutgers. And so it's something that, this is true with almost all the land grant universities in the country, that we've embraced this approach, this IPM approach. And it's been with us for quite a few decades now. Okay. All right. So when I would work and I would go to these landscapers and their sites of their clients, I have to stop that cover treatment mentality that they had, and to do more of a selective or kind of a target applications. So that was the first big step that I had to try to convince them to do. And that wasn't actually always easy, because many of their clients that they had been used to someone coming out and just spraying down the entire landscape. And I think it's a misconception, but in their minds of the homeowners, they were thinking, well, this is a protective chemical umbrella. And I think that was the mindset that they had, and not realizing that most of our pesticides probably last a week or so, and they begin, the residual starts to break down. Some of the longer ones, like the pyrethroids, might on bark or a tree might last 3 weeks, but that's for the most part. There's exceptions to that. We have these neonicotinoids that last for a year or so. I don't know, did I talk about the neonicotinoids last time I was here? Yeah, I don't know about the commercial group. Have you heard about the neonicotinoids? Yeah, that's, as far as residential landscapes, it's something that after next year, according to the new regulations in the state of New Jersey, is no longer going to be available for use. And now there might be some special exceptions. When I say neonicotinoids, there's materials like maybe you've heard as merit or safari. Those are the neonicotinoids, and they are, the problem with those is that they do last in the trees for over a year, some of them, and they create a problem with pollinators. And whether the honeybee decline disorder that's been around for maybe 15 years or so, that is probably erroneously been stated that was the cause of that is the neonicotinoids, but that's really not the case. It could be a contributing factor and maybe local areas. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know that the neonicotinoids were no longer, and I assume that's the case with merit. If any of you with turf do grub controls, yeah, they're no longer going to be available for use. I guess you have to do that again next year, and then after that, you can do it in maybe non-residential areas. I'm not sure the details of that yet. All right, so just remember that we're doing more of a not the broadcast cover treatment there on the left, but the more target selective sprays. Okay, but it's important to realize that IPM involves a whole lot more than just monitoring or and then selectively spraying pesticides. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. But it's more than just simply that. But that's a big first step. You have to monitor to do my IPM, because if you don't monitor or scout, you can use those two terms interchangeably, you can't do IPM, because you have to have that information to make the decisions. Okay. So these are the methods I've already talked about: cultural, biological, and chemical. And it's the use of, many of these methods, and it's maybe increasing the tools available in the toolbox as far, and not just simply going with chemical. Again, going back to my early years, that's what we did in the early 80s with our pest control. We sprayed chemicals. We really didn't do anything else. Because it was kind of a production orientated company. And so we were moving around from landscape to landscape, just spraying everything. Move to the next one, spray it all. So that's not IPM for sure. Okay. So this is a simple diagram showing you the center area might be the axis, of the wheel, for example, and that's monitoring, that's the core focus. And with that information that is gotten from monitoring, then we can make control decisions, determine if something needs to be done, because sometimes you don't have to do anything. And we get onto a landscape back in my early years, we'd spray something with why are we spraying it? There's no need for it. And then yet we had homeowner customers who thought that's what we did. And if I didn't spray a particular group of plants because I looked them over and there's nothing there that was a problem, they'd complain, oh no, you didn't complete the application, you just sprayed these plants. I said, well, I monitored for them, there's nothing there to spray. It would be irresponsible for me to do it. It would be, environmentally irresponsible as well. Most of them accepted that, but there was some none. They thought of it as exterminators. We weren't plant managers, we were exterminators, at least in their mind. So I realized that was a company I didn't want to stay with for too many years. I was there for a few years though. But so we go with the cultural, the biological, and the chemical to intervene when it's necessary. And I'll talk about those three terms now in more detail. Before I get there, if this was plant health care, this is really what we're looking for. In this pyramid, where we're putting most of our emphasis on the cultural, which I'll just talk about in just a moment. And then secondary would be biological. And really, it's only when those two fail that then we go to the chemical. Okay. It's always the easiest thing to do, just go right to the chemical. And maybe it's the easiest, fastest way to make money too, which maybe it's a problem with the industry to some level. So here's our cultural practices. I think they're good basic horticultural gardening skills that a lot of homeowners maybe think they know how to do them correctly, but oftentimes they don't. But this is all these. There's many more than what I have listed here. I just threw what I had available on the page to make room. But some of the ones that are misdone by homeowners is definitely mowing. No question. It depends upon the species of turf grass you have. They cut the grass too short and creates more weeds for them when they do that. Mulching, my gosh, how many years have we been talking about over mulching? The mulching volcanoes. It's not good for trees, creates problems. And there's many other things as well. So this is what we mean by cultural controls. It's good basic horticultural practices. Okay. If you were an arborist, this is what you spend most of your time doing, especially if you're working with trees, pruning, proper pruning. That's often done improperly by homeowners too. And unfortunately, even commercial operations do some ill-advised pruning techniques. So that's something that is done incorrectly quite often. And so when we have biological control, and this is something that's changing now. Again, in my early years, biological control, we didn't pay attention to it. Yeah, we knew, probably called them ladybugs. Of course, now they're lady beetles, but we didn't know much more than it. We had praying mantids, and maybe that's about it. And there's a lot of other ones, though, that we weren't quite sure of, especially the immature stages or the larvae or the nymphal stages. They don't quite look like the adults necessarily. And we just assumed it was an insect. If it moved, we needed to kill it. And that was the mindset that too many of us had. And we have parasitoids, which I'll talk about as well. These are actually parasites that kill the host. Fleas are parasites, but they're not parasitoids. Generally, they're not going to kill the cat that they infest. Parasitoids are either wasps or fly species. And I'll talk about those toward the end. Then we have pathogens. You know, one of our better pathogens, I think I did talk about this last time, was the endophytes in turf. Endophytes came around 1990 for the commercial industry. It's basically within seed, they provide a fungal material that grows with the grass, and it moves into the blades of the grass, and it's a toxin to insects. And so it's a symbiotic relationship. It doesn't hurt the turf grass, but it does kill, surface feeding insects like chinch bugs or sod webworms and those types of insects on turf. Not grubs though, it doesn't move into the root system. Okay. All right, so biocontrol, when I would talk to them about this tactic, this approach, there's different ways you can do it, but probably the best way for someone like a landscaper is just conserve them. Try not to avoid killing them unnecessarily. I mean, they're working for us for free. Learn what they are, recognize them, kind of assess the numbers that they have, because they're actually ratios. For example, lady beetles, a ratio with aphids, 50-1. One lady beetle can successfully suppress 50 aphids. There's another one with spider mites. It's the Stepharis, which is the spider mite destroyer. It's, I think the ratio there is about 10-1. So one of those will successfully suppress 10 spider mites. So they're often going to be in the pest population. We just have to be able to monitor for them to see if they are there, what their ratio numbers are. And you can make decisions of what kind of treatment, if you even need. Okay. So augmentation is being done a lot today with greenhouses. I do work a lot with greenhouses. And it's something that's not universal yet because it takes good effort and a lot of planning to do biocontrol with beneficial insect releases. But it can be very successful if you studied up on it and know what types of predators to release against certain pests. And so that's something that's being done more and more. I would suspect within certainly 15, 20 years, at least in commercial greenhouses, that'll become the norm. It'll be standard to have biocontrol take care of almost all their insect pest problems. So there's so many success stories being done over the last couple of decades or so. 20 years ago, it was just barely being used, and now over the years, it's being done more successfully, and it's something that will continue. And then importation, I mentioned the fact with the Vidalia beetle, we went over to Australia, and that would be called importation. Something, of course, that usually researchers or governments can do, not people like ourselves. Wouldn't be permitted. Okay. So what's a good IPM type of an insecticide? And I should say pesticides, because remember, we're also talking about fungicides and herbicides. And also when I say pests, it can be more than just insects, diseases or weeds. What's probably New Jersey's #1 pest in the landscape? What? No, you've got to think bigger than that. No, much bigger than that. Which one? Well, that's certainly become a problem. But what's one that you just, when I say it, you'll say, oh, of course, deer, deer, deer #1. Oh yeah, it's a terrible problem. All my nursery growers, they all have had to fence in their properties with. Most of them have like 7-foot or 8-foot fencing. It's really expensive. Some of these nurseries are big, and they put this fencing because they're the deer damage. They couldn't control it. They kept coming in. Now with the fencing, it works. But yeah, that's probably the #1 pest. So anyway, pesticides need to be fairly host specific. Now these are all ideals, and there's some cases we just can't. It's hard for any one insecticide or herbicide or fungicide to meet all these characteristics, but it would be nice if it's just going to hit the target. That's the trend that with a lot of our newer insecticides, especially now, is that they're designed to just kill the insect pest you're going after, or maybe a select number of pests.
Can I make a comment?
Collateral damage and not wipe everything out. And so, and then being short residual, I mentioned the problem with the neonicotinoids and the pollinators. Their problem is that they have a long residual in trees, and they can last, I know a imidacloprid or a merit can last a full year in a tree. So that creates the problem with the pollinators. You just can't avoid it. They're going to be, some of them are, the honeybees in particular, are going to be affected by the imidacloprid or the merit. So, and I actually hated to see that regulation go into effect, because I think the neonicotinoids are such valuable insecticides. And so and maybe I have a bias in favor of the pesticide industry a little bit. But if you're an anti-pesticide advocate, it makes sense. You got to go after the neonicotinoids, because what is the #1 insecticide use in the country? Neonicotinoids. So as far as insecticides, so I'm sure they're feeling really good now, at least in New Jersey. And they'll probably continue. I know there's other states who have been doing it as well. So, and actually in Europe, not all countries in Europe, but many countries in Europe, they have banned the use of the neonicotinoids because of the concerns with the pollinators. So, but just remember, I need to emphasize, the honeybee decline disorder was not caused by neonicotinoids. I mean, it could be a contributing factor in some small local areas, but it's not the cause. It's actually something else, probably from varroa mites, which it's a mite that parasitizes the honeybees. That's probably the #1 problem. Okay. And there's other things like habitat loss. So, and maybe, I don't know if it's really affecting them yet, but the changing of the climates that we've been experiencing, I'm sure that's a factor as well. Forces them to move to other areas. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about resistance as well, and I'm spending more time on this than I usually do, so I move around faster if I can. This is our major insecticide group that we deal with. Organochlorines, they're pretty much gone. That would be the DDT, things like chloridane. My dad used to use chloridane. That's not available for use in residential areas anymore. But then we still have these organophosphates in them, but a lot of those are starting to go away as well. Diazinon and Dursban, they're no longer, they're restricted use, no longer can be used in residential landscapes. And also increasingly in some of the other areas, they're no longer being made available either. So, and then pyrethroids, they kind of become the workhorse, especially, this is kind of unfortunate maybe, because of the fact that the neonicotinoids are going to be apparently starting to be phased out. We have to have alternatives to use. And one of them, not for something like grub control, the pyrethroids won't work there. But pyrethroids are those materials that they're really inexpensive. They don't have really harsh toxicity they're not mammalian toxicity. It's relatively low. However, they do wipe out a lot of insects, and they're very tough on things like fish as well. This is probably the one that may be starting to be used more often now that the neonicotinoids, and it's inexpensive too. Pyrethroids are relatively cheap, so they're going to be used, and they last a long time. They can last, over a week in the landscape, 3 weeks on bark. So that's one that's kind of unfortunate. We have these consequences that take place. We remove the neonicotinoids, and then there's a void created. What's going to replace it? Hopefully, it's alternatives that are, more biorational or reduced risk. That's the idea. But not always. Sometimes even these other ones that are undesirable kind of fill that void. And maybe in some cases, it's going to be the overuse of pyrethroids, which are already being overused. Okay. And then when we have the ones that have the arrows, they would be what we would call the more reduced risk That's an EPA term, or you can another term that's often used as biorationals. They just have a lower negative impact to the environment. And they have a tendency not to be a carpet bombing of the landscape that you're applying and wiping everything out and causing a disruption to the equilibrium, but they're more selective, like a laser guided cruise missile. Just hit the target and avoid the collateral damage. So that's what some of these others are getting more and more alike. And then we have things like soaps and oils that only last a very short period of time and a very short residual, and relatively non-toxic for people. So. All right, so IPM, what do we focus on? It's kind of a step-by-step approach. Knowledge is probably the most important thing. You have to have a little bit of experience and knowledge before you can begin to monitor, which is the key focus. So you can't just send someone, if you're a commercial operator, you just say, well, go monitor the landscape. So what do you mean? You have to have a background of, what are some of the key things to look for as far as the key insects, key plants, key locations, and that will help you determine, to be more effective and efficient at monitoring. But once you get that down, then you get this information, you can make decisions and you can intervene where it's necessary. Cultural, biological, chemical, combination of all three. Reduced risk chemicals if it can be done. And then when you do that, you go back and you evaluate, did it work or did it not? So that's the step-by-step with the whole IPM approach. Okay. We did a survey quite a long time ago. I used to, probably close to 15 years ago now. Look at that, 2000, 22 years ago. So maybe I should not show this slide anymore. Maybe it's so out of date, but I don't know. I show this slide sometimes to commercial groups that I'm speaking to, and they said, boy, I don't know, I think this cover spray 17%, it's higher than that. So maybe they know, they're in the industry, they see a lot of people when they do applications. So we did a survey to determine what types of spray approaches the commercial landscapers were doing in New Jersey. And based on the answers that they came up with, and this is good number of people that we surveyed, and I think, as I remember, we had over 900 responses from landscape companies who sent us what they did, and hopefully they were honest. They provided us, and but they said that based on their answers, 17% of them did cover sprays, and then see and spray where they didn't monitor, but they just waited to see if a problem happened. Maybe if there was a homeowner client, they would wait for the client to tell them, or they would just happen to be there at the time when it was obvious that damage was taking place, and they'd see, and then they would intervene. But it wasn't really catching things early, and they weren't monitoring for it. So sometimes the damage was already pretty evident when they finally did an intervention. So that's not IPM either. And then about 28% said that they did monitor and they sprayed. So that's the very big first step with IPM. Yeah, they did monitor. Okay, and they did some selective treatments. They didn't do broadcast cover treatments. So that was much better. And then about a quarter of them said that they did what we consider to be basic IPM. They monitored, they did selective treatments, they attempted to use a lot of the reduced risk type insecticides, and they also maybe looked at the beneficials that were present and did ratio estimations as far as the pest versus predator ratios, and they made decisions based on that. So they got a little more sophisticated. So I don't know what the case is today. I don't work with landscape groups anymore. I work with, as I said, greenhouse and nursery. But other surveys have been done like this in other states, and it's pretty similar. They come with the results, and so I hope that this 26% has gone up a lot higher. I don't know what it is. I suspect it has since 2000. I don't know. We're not quite at 50%. Yeah.
Does anybody ever just go in and say, hey, let's look at your monitor and spray records to see? Because I can easily say I do a monitor and spray, or I do basic IPM.
Yeah.
And unless you're looking at records,
that's true.
I can tell you I'm doing that, And the other thing is the cost here. If you're gonna do
Yeah.
a monitoring program and I'm coming out to do your bushes, that's a cost that Steve will know, you have to figure in.
Sure.
I'm
sure.
sending someone out there, first of all, he has to know what he's looking at.
Yeah,
Hey, we're gonna look at your bushes, we're gonna charge you $25 to come out. We're gonna make a determination, and this is gonna be a cost that you as a homeowner are gonna incur. Now, I'm not totally pesticide, but you have to kind of balance it. That's where I think we have to be anti and pesticide, we have to balance it.
yeah,
Because there's a cost involved.
yeah. No question. I agree with everything you just said. Over the years, when this was first starting to be promoted, that was a common concern, is the cost. And it was very legitimate too, because monitoring does take time and you have to charge for that time. And one of the good features about record keeping, though, is that if you do maintain the record keeping, and hopefully it's digitized, and then it can be reviewed each time whoever goes onto that piece of property, and they can review where the problems have been in the past, and they can not ignore other things, to always be aware of as you monitor, but focus and key in on those problems that had been there previously.
And it gives you a time frame and say, hey, look, we need to go out and look at Steve's property because he knows.
That's right. Yeah, the time.
This issue, March, April,
Yeah,
so we need to call Steve to let him know that's go out and look, and we can jump on it before it comes.
that's so key too. Yeah, the time of year and the plants that are there will depend a lot on monitoring focus. The plant and the time of year, that determines, as far as insects at least, and to a good extent diseases as well, because many of them are going to be spring orientated, based on that time when a lot of, especially foliar leaf spot types, if you want to prevent that. Now that has to be preventative. You don't wait to monitor, determine if the leaf spot is on a tree. It's too late. You have to do a preventative fungicide treatment. So that's the key difference between a lot of our, especially with fungal leaf spot type diseases, is that you're not monitoring with disease. You have an idea if a disease is likely to be on a plant, so you have to be preventative with your fungicide. With insects, you have a little more time there to maybe wait. If there's been a history of a problem with insects on you almost certain it's going to be there, then you can do preventative with that also. And that was kind of the nice thing about materials with systemics like neonicotinoids. So anyway, that would probably get more involved than what the homeowner wants to know. So, but that's what you're correct about that.
Apparently have to identify.
Yeah.
No idea how bad they are. We're out doing some monitoring now.
I know.
Some trees, sometimes 30 big nasty. Doesn't feet might be another 30 or 40 foot high.
Yeah.
And there's 20 or 30 trees there. So just multiply that every egg nest, not all the egg has, but just imagine how many
Yeah.
all.
The egg masses, those of you who are familiar with the spotted lanternfly, of course, the egg masses are been laid, and that's the phase that they're in right now. And if it's a large tree, a vast majority of them, probably 90% of them, are going to be above probably 10 feet. It's a big tree, and they're going to be out of reach. Small tree, you can see maybe the egg masses and remove them. One thing that's been researched and continues is the use of dormant oil against the egg masses. It seems to have not 100% control, but I've seen some results around 70, 75%.
We're doing
Yeah.
the oil.
Yeah.
Try to stay away from
Okay.
shed if the tree's 30 or 40
Yeah.
foot high, if you want to get everybody at the top.
The systemics, like I think what's been recommended is the dinotefron, which is a neonicotinoid.
Yeah.
And that's one that I think is often recommended for homeowners, is a bark treatment, because it's the easy, you don't need any kind of elaborate equipment, just a hand can sprayer. spray about 5 feet, start at 5 feet, and just with this mixture that you make of it's called Trans-Tech, and just go around the circumference of the tree until you get to the base. And so you have to, kind of make sure you have an idea of the amount that you need to put on the tree based on the diameter of the tree. But you put a spreader sticker with that, and that will only that'll last maybe about 3 months. It's not like a metacloprid that lasts a year, which is merit. However, that's a neonicotinoid, and apparently that's going to be taken away unless they provide exceptions for commercial landscapers. Because I know it's not going to be available to homeowners at all. But if you're a licensed commercial applicator, pesticide license, you can use it next year. But then I don't know if there's going to be maybe special permissions that are going to be allowed for things like invasive pests, like spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borers, because that works really well against those pests.
And then when we're finding, when you take that product away, it's systemic, then you're either going to go egg masses or you're going to do contact treatments.
Yeah,
Well, if you do a contact treatment, now you're going to the broad spectrum
that's
where
right.
the product you're using may affect honeybees. So we try to time it for nighttime treatment as it's the same as mosquitoes. So you're trying to cut down the contact with your beneficials. But I'll be honest with you, in all treatments, there's going to be a few beneficials or
Sure.
are going to have to, I don't say it this way quite it does, but you got to weigh the two to say, okay, well, the beneficials, you want the lanternflies, and I can tell you the lanternflies are going to be worse than mosquitoes.
Yeah, I'm sure New Jersey has not seen the worst of it yet. It's continuing to build up, and it's pretty much spread throughout most of all the counties in New Jersey, although some are much higher densities than others. But that can change and fluctuate from year to year. And so they're working on developing. We don't really have any good native predators that are effective against them. They're working on bringing something over from China, some parasitoids that are being worked upon.
Isn't there a
But-
white fungus up there? I heard there was a biological like a fungus or something from the
Well, yes, there are some fungi. I know one of them is called Entomophica, which actually works against the gypsy moth as well. That has some, it's not the exact same fungus, but it's very similar to it. And there's a number of different items that they're working on. So actually, I gave this talk. What talk did I give last week or 2 weeks ago?
Lawns.
Oh, long. It was 4 weeks ago. I gave the insect talk. I did spend some time on the spotted lanternfly, but that was virtual, wasn't it?
Mhm.
So, yeah, I didn't get a chance to get good questions like that. That was so good. Yeah. I don't want to spend any more time on this one, but it's the key thing we need to be worried about as far as insect pests in the foreseeable future. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. I used in the past, organic treatment of Rocky now
Right.
and treated with essential oils and organic.
Okay.
He's also a beekeeper.
Yeah.
And so he was highly interested in protecting the colony. It didn't last weeks, but it would help a lot of areas. Is there anybody around here who does that, or is that anything that is even considered?
Yeah. Well, you can contact even the more traditional chemical companies. They will have access to something like a neem oil. Maybe that's what they were using. That has some impact, some control. It probably needs to be done multiple times, though. The thing is with the spotted lanternflies, regarding the adults, they can last for many months. They begin to emerge as adults as early as late July in some parts of New Jersey. And you can actually see them at the very end before it gets too cold at the end of November, even possibly December. And so that's many months of the act. And they do have migration periods, especially in September. And there's other times when they can migrate a bit too, but there are certain times when the adults want to look, oftentimes they're searching for the tree of heaven. But if they're not any in the area, then they have alternative trees they will feed on. Things like, willows and black walnuts, red maples, and they will be able to survive and complete their life cycle on other trees that are not tree of heaven. But it has been shown that the number of eggs, and this is still early preliminary research, they're not sure how much of a reduction in the eggs there. If the female never has a chance to feed on a tree of heaven throughout her entire life, then the number of eggs that she lays, the typical egg mass has 30 to 50. But she may only lay like 8 to 12. So that's a reduction. What is that, like an 80% reduction? I mean, it's not eliminating them, but it's significant. So that's been shown that maybe in some areas you maybe remove the tree of heaven or use maybe 10% of it. And you have a lot of trees in your landscape that you have control over. We maybe remove all of them except perhaps 10% of them. You have maybe 20 of them, keep 2, make sure they're males. And then this is where the neonicotinoids came into play because they've used it as a trap tree. You kill them, they all go to that tree or the 2 trees or whatever, and it kills. But that, unfortunately, that might be eliminated as a future option. Okay, I think enough time on spider lanternfly. I'm not going to get through this. Those are great questions, though. So thanks. All right. So maybe I'm just going to kind of skip around a little faster so I can try to get toward the end if it's possible. Gosh, I have 3 hours. So I'm not going to make it. And so just remember, it's not black and white. It's a continuum. There's certain levels of how much you're going to embrace it. And the ones that are doing no IPM are chemically dependent, low decision making, limited information. These are the calendar broadcast cover sprayers. Okay, they're not doing IPM. Then you have an emerging program. Maybe you do it on this is for commercial operations, and you maybe do it on a few of your landscapes that you think might be receptive to this approach. See how it's successful for you. And then as you get better at it and you do good note taking and you maybe increase your efficiency of monitoring, you can move around faster. You can have a basic program in place and maybe a higher percentage of your landscape people can do this, or your clients you can do it with. And then it's hard to get to that optimal, which is biologically dependent, culturally dependent, high decision making, intensive information, especially if you're a landscape company. Maybe you're going to only be on the property, some cases, maybe at most once a month. I mean, there's a lot that you're going to miss in that period of time. So when I did this mentoring program, the people who were really able to take hold of this approach were those people who were landscape estate managers. They often lived on the property. Of course, we're talking a lot of money here, and the people who own the estate, and maybe it's 15, 20 acres or so in some cases, these were big places. And they were provided housing right there on site. And they lived there. And they can, every day, they could walk around and do things. And so they could really do this type of an approach, but that's the exception. And of course, for the vast majority of the industry, they wouldn't be able to do this type of approach. So, all right, so what we want to do here is talk about how insect resistance takes place. I have a very simple schematic, number of diagrams that will show how it's done. We'll talk about pest resurgence, secondary pest outbreak, and then some of the non-targets, which I probably don't even cover, won't have time. So as far as pest resistance to insecticides, I want to focus on insecticides here, although the same thing, resistance also happens with herbicides. It can also happen with fungicides. And so it's just not insecticide, but I'm going to focus on it just for my own convenience. But just showing you here the decades, and it stops at 1990, so this probably should be updated slide. But you notice in the earlier part of the century, the 20th century, that the number of insect pests species that had resistance was this flatline because there weren't a lot of insecticides being used. And so there wasn't much of resistance taking place, okay? But then as things started to change, if we moved into the 50s, especially the 60s, we got a lot more of these insecticides becoming available, and a lot more insecticide spraying companies. The landscape industry kind of had a boom to it. It kind of started this, I think the landscape industry commercial really boomed in the 60s, and it's taken off ever since. And so you see how the line kind of just exponential type increase. Right. So as far as aphids and resistance, this is one that will take place more often. You find it occurring in greenhouses. It's because those insects that have multiple generations per season. I don't know how many generations aphids can have. Probably at least a dozen, because they give birth in the landscape. The aphids, they're all females as they go through their generational life cycles. And it's called genetic type of reproduction. There are no males, and they don't lay eggs. They give birth to live young. Aphids do. And then it's only in the fall when temperatures cool down that males are starting to be produced, and they mate. Then the females lay eggs that overwinter. So when you have resistance, it's often taking place with those types of pests that have multiple generations and high numbers per generation. So that's when resistance is more likely to occur. Okay, and especially in greenhouses. And to show you how it's done, here is an example of a wild population. Let's say they're aphids. Okay, maybe each one of these circles represents dozens of aphids and not just one. And maybe just a very small percentage, or probably less than 1% of the individuals within this population, they will be resistant to a particular mode of action that you are thinking about using. Okay, and how this works is that just a very small percentage, any large population will have genetic diversity to it. That's just how life is. We all have, there's genetic diversity with all species. Okay, but just for some very small percentage, or maybe have a genetic capability, maybe they produce a complex number of enzymes. It doesn't often provide much of a benefit to them. You can see, because only very few of them actually, and so it's not passed on, because it's always there, kind of a background. But these aphids that have this enzyme, there's no competitive advantage for them unless you start applying an insecticide that's killing off all the others that don't have enzymes. And so they are not reproducing, but since these enzymes are able to break down and degrade the active ingredient in those, whatever insecticide you're using, it breaks down the active ingredient rapidly, and it doesn't kill them because of these enzymes. And so let's see how it happens when we go through a spray program. This is very simplistic. It's not going to happen this fast, but just to give you an idea, just a general idea how it works. And so you spray, you do a really good job. In fact, usually if you get 80% control in the landscape with an insecticide, it's considered to be good. It's pretty good, 80%. If it's a decent large population. So, and they said, all right, good. I don't think you have to worry about this for a while. Then you come back, say a few weeks later, and boy, they're back again. But there was one small change. They reproduced. When you sprayed them initially, the ones that were vulnerable in green, for whatever reason, they didn't get the coverage. They didn't have contact, or it wasn't of sufficient quantity to kill them. And so they were just able to continue to reproduce. And so they did. But then one kind of major difference is the fact that small groups that have this resistant gene that creates these enzymes, they increased to a higher level percentage wise. So maybe you start getting up around 3-4% of the population. Then you spray again, the same mode of action. When they say on the label that you should rotate your chemicals and use different modes of action, this is the reason. because you don't want to keep using that same mode of action. If you do it continually, you're promoting this type of resistance to take place. So many times on the label of an insecticide, they will give you resistant management suggestions, or in some cases, it's the law. There's some chemicals you can't use more than once a year because they're concerned about resistance taking place. So, you come back and you see this, you don't know that there's a resistant change taking place. And you say, oh, I'll spray again. It worked good last time. I bet it does a good job this time as well. And it did. It really went heavy. It got good coverage. And you knocked out almost all of them that were vulnerable to it. The ones that weren't affected, they were okay, and they continued to reproduce. And then you come back again, and you see the big change taking place already. I think it's been said, once you get a population that has reached somewhere in the 20% resistance, that population is on its way. If you use that chemical again a few more times, it's going to be resistant to it. And so, but it doesn't happen this fast, is what I'm showing in these diagrams. And so you come back and you say, wow, what's going on here? I better really spray heavy again. And you do it, now you have a completely resistant population to that specific mode of action. So I think there's been a rule of thumb with a lot of chemicals that don't apply them any more than 3 consecutive times. But that's not the same. And the label will tell you sometimes what you can or can't do. So, unfortunately, a lot of people, we're not reading the labels, so we're not even aware of what's happening. So I've already mentioned this, the number of generations per season and the number of offspring per generation. And these numbers are, if there's a lot, each one of these are high, really speeds up the potential for resistance. Okay. All right, enough on that. Let's talk about pest resurgence and how, now this is where we're dealing with broad spectrum insecticides. I should have emphasized that even with the resistance part. These are broad spectrum insecticides. They're just generally bug killers, okay? And so this is what happens when you use these materials, other than, even though some of the most strict resistance management requirements on these newer, more reduced risk insecticides, they have very strict requirements of how often you can use them. And so, because they don't want the resistance, even though it's not a broad spectrum, it can still develop resistance if you use them, the mode of action, too many times. Okay. So let's talk about how pest resurgence works. And which plant do you think of these? These are arborvitaes. Which one do you think has spider mites on it? It's a trick question. I'm sorry?
I think you left in the middle.
Well, I tell you, this is an interesting scenario. It happened. This is one of my earlier years, and it happened in the mid-90s. I went, and I always had a camera with me, even back then. It wasn't a digital camera though. And the landscaper at this client's home, he knew what was going on. He knew exactly what happened. He said, "Yeah, the homeowner didn't call me until they made the decision to do something on their own, and they really made a mistake. They had a spider mite population on the one on the left. It hadn't moved yet. This was a big road too, because they were starting to spread. When I finally got there, they were starting to spread. But initially, it was just on one plant. Apparently, that's what the homeowner said. But they didn't know it was spider mites. They thought it was under drought stress." Okay, and so you can't even see it, but kind of my name there is blocking it. There's a soaker hose that the homeowner wrapped around the trunk of the tree, and he just let it go and forgot about it. And it just simply saturated the soil with, and the oxygen was driven out. Roots require oxygen to grow and survive. So it was killing the tree, made it worse. And so the mites that were there, we're going to move to another tree that's healthier. And they started doing that. And so they're now here in this middle one. You can even see they're moving to the one on the right too. They see that leading edge. What spider mites do is they are sucking, piercing type insects, tiny creatures, about 1/50th of an inch in size, so most of you are probably familiar with spider mites. And they suck out the cells. They don't feed on things like aphids will feed on the phloem or the conducting tissues, and they release the honeydew. Well, mites don't do that. They feed in the cells, and they also remove the green chlorophyll within those cells, and they kill the cells, and it causes that discoloration in place. And so anyway, so the one on the left is the two-spotted spider mite, which is a common mite in the landscape. Actually wasn't the one that was feeding on the arborvitaes. These were spruce spider mites. But the two-spotted spider mite is one that likes the hot, dry conditions. All mites like it dry, but some of them like it cooler. We have cool season mites and warm season mites. And so the two-spotted spider mite, which is going to be on your flowers, your annuals. If you have a barning bush, Euonymus elatus, and they love that plant. It's a sentinel plant for two-spotted spider mites. And they feed multiple generations, 10, 15 generations a year. They'll defoliate that tree, the bush. We know the burning bush that we want that vibrant red color in the fall. Well, if they're having an infestation of spider mites, it's going to defoliate. And those shrubs are not in the year. It's usually you're not going to have that red color for that season. So anyway, and the one on the right, by the way, is a predator. Okay. And I tell you, this talk, Mary, I have really been diverting myself more than I've ever done in my entire career at Rutgers. I don't know if I'm going to get through a quarter of my slides. This is terrible. But the one on the right is a predaceous mite. It's a good mite. It's a predator mite. Okay. And this is a nice graph, simplistic graph, showing the density of both the beneficial mite as well as the two-spotted spider mite, which is in red. The beneficial is in green. The predator mite. The density of them on the y-axis. The x-axis shows the time moving from left to right. And the threshold is right here, this horizontal line there. And so when we want to avoid the density to go above that threshold, because when it does, the damage becomes unacceptable. Now we can accept a certain level of damage, especially in the landscape. It's been shown maybe 5–10% of damage is acceptable for like many homeowners. If it exceeds that, then they start noticing it. But if it's less than 5% or so, or even some of them, about 50% of them like that, they accepted that 5 to 10% damage. And so greenhouse and nursery, like I said in the beginning, that's different. They're selling these plants, and they have a lower threshold. They can't ship and sell plants that are infested. Landscape, we can tolerate higher levels. Okay, so this is showing you there is a level of a pest present. But the beneficial mites, and maybe it's more than just a single beneficial, it could be other predators as well, other than just the predator mite species. But they're keeping a good job of preventing it from getting above the threshold. Okay, so then you come in, really pay attention to the beneficials that are there, and maybe you see the mites and maybe a very slight damage taking place, not serious. Oh, I got to spray anyway. Maybe you think you need to because you won't be back again for 4 or 5 weeks. I got to spray on my side. That's the problem with not having such long intervals between visits. And so you do make an application. Really wasn't required, wasn't needed, but boy, you set yourself up to having a problem. It knocks out the two-spotted spider mite, which is great. The predator mites or any other predators that were there were also knocked out if you're using a broad spectrum type of a miticide or a chemical that kills off a lot of things, kind of like carpet bombing, right? And then what occurs is that there's a time lag between the beneficial recovery and the pest resurgence. This is often the case where the pest can outproduce the beneficials in a short period of time until equilibrium is reestablished once again. So we've disrupted that equilibrium here with a pesticide or a miticide in this case that wasn't needed. And therefore, the beneficials do recover, but not until the pests which built up faster, have now exceeded the threshold. And this is what's called a pesticide treadmill. You know, and I've spoken to groups, commercial groups, where they say, well, what's wrong with that? It's good. They need me to come back. And that's not the type of attitude we would think. But hey, if you're there for just making the money, I can understand it. But well, that's the company I worked for when I first started in the industry. Yeah, we can promote independence. They need us to keep coming back, and we're going to make sure they need us. So we keep doing these broadcast cover calendar treatments. Okay. Yeah.
So when should you never use the full section?
Well, I would not say that. There are times, it's a good comment. There are times when you maybe need to, if there's no other good alternative. So, you know, IPM doesn't mean you can't use chemicals. It's just we're trying to use them in a more, you know, efficient way. Yeah, there may be a case. Yeah, I understand your question totally. There may be a situation where you've come onto the scene late. And maybe an example, a simplistic example would be, we all know bagworm caterpillars. Probably, maybe New Jersey's #1 insect pest, I don't know. And they like to feed on many different hosts, evergreen as well as deciduous. Conifers seem to be their favorite. They love the arborvitaes, for example. They feed on many different types of, you know, evergreen conifers. And if you got the high population that's really starting to build up and causing a lot of damage, you can't play around with the more, you know, reduced risk materials that are not going to be all that effective, especially against the larger insects. And that's when maybe a broad spectrum is going to have to, you're going to have to compromise. If you want to save the trees from being totally defoliated. I just know this example in my years where I got a phone call. I think they were Leyland cypress actually, and they were surrounding a nursery. And they were big trees too. They were probably 15-foot trees. There was hundreds of them completely surrounding the nursery. So you couldn't really see from the road. You just saw these evergreens surrounding it. It wasn't a big nursery, but still there was a few hundred of these trees. And they were severely infested with bagworms to the point where some of the trees were getting close to maybe being killed. So they wanted to protect the ones because they've been growing there for years. So I said, you got to go with a pyrethroid, which is a general broad spectrum chemical. Yeah, it's going to knock out everything. You might promote a spider resurgence, but that's going to be better than having the trees defoliated. Because once conifers are defoliated, they usually don't recover. So there's exceptions. Yeah.
Steve, can I just request that if you're asking a question, can you please ask it louder, or if Steve, you can
I
repeat
need to
it?
repeat it. I forget that we're being
Okay,
recorded.
thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Mary. I should repeat them anyway. The acoustics are so good here. Yeah. So anyway, all right, enough of that one. Now let's finish up with secondary pest outbreak and how are we doing with time?
It's 10:20.
Okay, 10 minutes. We'll take a break. Okay. All right. Secondary pest outbreak this is what happens. You know, a good example with this one. Now, how many of you are landscape tree shrub type applications? I knew you were. just two of you. Okay. Well, this talk is designed for you guys. Yeah. So the other ones I would suspect maybe turf orientated, turf managers. Yeah. Yeah. So here for the credit. I get it. So let's talk about secondary pest. Well, this is, you know, even though if you work with turf, you still have if you have homeowners, they'll ask you questions about trees, right? And your shrubs. So it's not like it's totally of no value to you. Yeah. So secondary outbreak, happens if you ask a lot of you know, nursery, landscape, golf course superintendents, what have you, who take care of trees. What is their number one tree shrub pest that they have difficulty controlling? I think oftentimes they'll say scale insects, especially a group of scales called the armored scales. The armored scales are, one of 17 families that by far is the most successful group of scales we deal with. The other one is soft scales, but they're relatively more easily controlled than the armored scales. So these are often stated to be the most difficult insects to control, are the armored scales. And the reason why is they have a waxy protective coating. You might liken it to, you all came in with cars or trucks. It's like the hood of your, covering the engine. The engine's the scale, the motor, and then you have the hood, that would be the protective cover or the scale. So it does a really good job of protecting that scale. If you can knock these scales off, if you knock them off just with your thumb, they'll leave like a little white ring that it's a scale. If you have a white ring that you have, that's no question, it's a scale. And then you maybe see the scale itself like a little blob of jelly. It's yellowish in color, or maybe reddish. Some of them are purple, but I don't think I have any pictures of that. But they're very vulnerable if they don't have that waxy cover over themselves. But it gives them great protection. Okay, and that's a picture of crawlers when they first emerge. This is when you try to do your timing of your treatments, because when the eggs hatch and they crawl out from underneath the female covers, the female is now dead, but the eggs that she laid are hatching, and they had to get out from underneath the dead scale that the female made for herself. Then they move around. That's almost probably not much larger than spider mites, 2-3 times the size of spider mites, but they're more colorful typically. They're yellowish or reddish in color typically. And one of the problems is that if we're using broad spectrum insecticides, we're killing off guys like this. This is one of these parasitoid wasps I talked about. They are extremely valuable in keeping our scales under control naturally, and just a natural suppression. What these guys do, this is the females do, with their leg-laying ovipositor, is that in this case you can see there's a scale. It's kind of like a flat, very close to the surface of the scale cover right here. And then the female wasp is using her ovipositor or egg-laying organ, inserting an egg through the wax, which will then hatch. And then the larvae of the wasp will begin to feed on this blob of jelly I was talking about and kills it. And it's been really successful. Without these parasitoids, we couldn't probably spray enough chemicals to keep scales under control, because these are so valuable for us, and we need to try to protect them. And we get ourselves in trouble if we're using these broad spectrum insecticides, especially if we're not timing them properly to go after the crawlers that are so vulnerable. You could take a jet spray of water when you see the crawlers coming out from the armored scales, knock them to the ground. You probably have done a pretty good job of suppressing that group of scales. They're unlikely to be able to climb back up again. They're little tiny things. They have little bitty legs that don't work very well. And but you want to get them before they begin to settle, these little crawlers, and they'll begin to feed as well in the cells. And then over time, they'll also produce a waxy cover over themselves for protection. So we want to catch during this vulnerable time period, and that's the importance of scouting. Okay, and know what scales and what time of year the particular species of scales is going to have the crawlers. This information is known, but it's something you just have to learn and have it available for you. If scale problems are taking place in your landscapes or wherever you work at, then you need to know the identity of the scales to learn when the crawlers are active, because that's when you do your best controls. Many times oils will work. Just, you don't have to use a harsh chemical at all. And that has almost no impact on the beneficials, like these wasps. Okay, so you can tell if you have them, these are juniper scales shown here. And if you look for these exit holes, that you know that it's been parasitized. A parasitoid wasp larvae fed inside, killed it, pupated, became an adult, but was still entombed and trapped underneath this dead waxy cover of the scale, and it had to cut its way out. So it cuts its way out, makes a hole in the waxy cover, and then can fly off. So you have a lot of these holes, and this was a case at a nursery I worked with, and still do work with. They had it was amazing. It was, I would say, more than 50% of the scales had these exit holes in them. And I had to convince the grower, because they wanted to go with a harsher broad spectrum material. It says, no, just wait for the crawlers. Those who weren't, didn't be killed by these wasps, wait until the crawlers emerge. Just go with an oil or something relatively benign. And sometimes oils can be a problem of phytotoxicities with some conifers. So you do have to be aware of that. You can maybe get the percentage down pretty low, maybe 0.75%. That'd still be effective against the crawlers. Less chance for phytotoxicity taking place. All right, and so this happens with, and I'll finish up and we'll take a break after this slide. This shows you here where a little more complicated, very similar to the primary pest resurgence, but with the secondary pest resurgence, here you maybe have the same scenario. Maybe you've got the spider mites in red, or maybe they're aphids, what have you. They're pests. You got the maybe complex of different types of beneficials in place. Okay, maybe the parasitoid wasps, maybe there's other types of predators there as well. Then you got the black, which is in this case, the armored scale. Okay, and you come in, again, you're blind, you're not paying attention. You don't even know what the scales are there, what even the species is. So there's no crawlers, apparently. You weren't even aware of that. The crawlers weren't going to be coming out for maybe another month. And you do an application, and or you maybe even miss the crawler period, even worse. And so you do an application, you disrupt everything. Prior to that application being made, there was a dynamic equilibrium that was in place. The thresholds were not being threatened by any of the pests. They're being kept below by the beneficials. You come in here with these broad spectrum chemicals and you wipe everything out. And then you get that time lag. That the scale insects with the armored, they weren't affected at all by the sprays because they were protected with that wax, and the crawlers weren't active, and so they started taking off. There's no predators at all anymore. They took off. The insecticide starts to wear off, and the mites or the aphids, they start taking off, and it just takes a while for the predators to build back up again. So and then before you had no problems, and now you got two. And so that makes it even worse. Yeah, eventually that time lag does set in, and the beneficials, if no more spraying is taking place and where you're knocking everything out, you allow them to build back up, eventually everything will come down and reestablish that equilibrium again, but not before damage has occurred. And so this is something you just simply want to try to avoid. I think my last statement here, again, going back to my history and the company I worked for, we would often say this to one another, fellow applicators. And you say, some of those properties we've had for the longest time, they have the worst scale, the armor scales. We weren't aware what we were doing. We were promoting armored scale populations with our counter treatment. Sometimes we got lucky and we hit the crawler period. Other times we missed and we made things worse. And I think there is one last slide. I'm not sure. This is my last slide, showing you this is the University of Maryland study indicating where the duration of cover sprays, green is less than 4 years. Blue is 4 years or more. So in those properties, 4 more years of these broadcast calendar treatments were being done. The scales here showing the euonymus scale, the white perniculus scale, the pine needle scale, they all got 2, 3, 4 times worse, as time went on, because of what we were doing and knocking out especially these parasitoid wasps that we were knocking out. We didn't even know that they were there. At that time, exit holes, I didn't know what they were. And it shows you how ignorant I was, but I was with everybody else. And 40 years later, I know better. So, all right, let's take a break.
Excuse me, Mary, has the program resumed?
Okay, we're good.
Okay. Just takes a minute or two.
No, go ahead.
It won't advance.
Oh,
I was telling Mary when I first came in this morning, back in the mid-90s, I had it was actually around 2000. It was the most simplistic advancer you could buy. It cost like $5. It lasted for 20 years and it never gave me any problems. And it was I think that's the thing is things get more complicated. There we go. So, this whole monitoring process, it can be difficult when you first attempt it. So that's what's often done is we try to simplify things a bit to make it more reasonable for people as they develop skills and to know what to look for and when and where. So we have these concepts that we call key plants and key pests and key locations, and it's designed to use these to make you simply more efficient when you monitor. Because we were talking before this morning earlier that time is a concern when you monitor, and if we can be more efficient with it, we can move along pretty fast. And so if we increase this type of knowledge, we can move pretty fast as we monitor. Okay. So as far as New Jersey, we have some of our typical key plants, and this is a listing of not all of them, but a good number of our plants that many of us already know. You probably have some of these in your landscape, or you have a neighbor that has them. They may be readily available in nurseries or in garden centers and so forth. Maybe they're overplanted in some situations, and then we have what we call our key pests. And the key pests are the ones that are going to be going after those key plants. So one kind of supports the other. And some of these, maybe you won't know all these, but I'm sure you're familiar with at least a few of them. We've already talked about spider mites, azalea lacebug. It's probably, azalea lacebug is probably New Jersey's #1 foundation pest in the residential landscapes. You ever notice that your azaleas or rhododendrons or pieris, hydrometas, these broadleaf evergreens, it kind of looks like they have a chlorotic look to them, almost like a variegated. And maybe you thought that was a variety. Well, it could be, but sometimes if it's infested with an azalea lacebug or another species of lacebug, you turn the leaf over and you see the insects, but they only feed on the undersides of the leaves. So if you don't turn the leaves over, you'll never realize that they're there. But they're so common, and I think a lot of homeowners don't even realize what they are because they're not really visible. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but we have birch leaf binder. I tell you, that is one that's pretty much fallen off the radar. When I worked in the industry, that was one of our probably top 5 insect pests that we dealt with. Because a lot of people had these birch trees, many of them were going to die in 10 to 20 years anyway because of the bronze birch borer, especially if they were Asian or European type species. Excuse me. And then they also had this leaf miner that just invariably would come every single spring. The leaves would come out and there would be 3 generations of them. So they just kept coming. And we would know, we would even do preventative treatments on this one. Excuse me, well, that must sound good on the recording. This is one where we actually didn't monitor for them necessarily. We knew that they were going to be there. And so we did preventative treatments as the leaves got larger. We'd spray something like an orthene, which is a translaminar or locally systemic type of an insecticide. But that's really gone now. I rarely see it. It's not that it's disappeared, but I rarely see the birch leaf miner. What happened to it? I'm not sure. Maybe some beneficial predators or parasitoids. I know some were released a few decades ago, a couple decades ago, and maybe they really did a good job on them. I haven't heard anything in the literature about why they've almost disappeared. And well, tell you, one that you know probably pretty well, kind of tells you spring has arrived with the eastern tent caterpillar. Okay, so these are the ones that we have a good idea of what they are. We know the plants they're going to feed on. And so these key plants and key pests helps a lot when you go to a landscape and we look around, we see the plants, we know what time of year the pests are going to be active if they're insects, and we can, you know, scout accordingly and we can move around pretty quickly. So, I really shortchanged them, but there's many more diseases that are italicized here that could be in play as well. Okay. There's a new disease coming in, by the way. It's called, you probably have heard of the oak wilt disease, perhaps. It's called oak wilt. It's been moving in from the west. None of one of these, this time it's not an insect. It's actually it's a type of, it's a bacteria. Yeah, it's a bacteria. It's infested from the west, or it's where it started, and it's moving in, and it's now just along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. And it's going to be continuing to move, and eventually it's going to get to New Jersey. And this is a wilt that kills the oak trees within a matter of weeks. And so this is something we'll be talking about probably within a decade for sure, if not less. Probably within 5 years, it'll be here. So that'll be something else we'll have to worry about. You know, now it's the spotted lanternfly, and so there'll be something else to replace that. Okay. Just remember that you know, all these pests, insects, or diseases, they don't all occur at once. They occur at different times of the season, and so that we need to know this based on the host that they're going to either infest or infect, and to react accordingly and intervene if it's helpful. Okay, kind of start things kind of start up, you know, usually April, and you know, when do we see the eastern tent caterpillar? That's sometime in April usually. In the wild black cherries or the crabapple trees, you know, the webbing we see in the branches of the forks of the trees, and that kind of tells you spring has arrived. Okay, and then we move July. Things kind of peak at that point, and then we move further into the summer, and then we get into the early fall weeks. Things start to drop considerably. But there are still things even way out beyond September. I mentioned some of these cool season spider mites. We have the spruce spider mite and the southern red spider mite. They like evergreens. The spruce spider mite feeds on conifers, and the southern red spider mite feeds on broadleaf evergreens. But they're active in the spring months. They go dormant during the summer. It's too hot for them. Then they start picking up again in September, and they peak many times late October or even into November. These mites will peak at that time. They reach the crescendo. And many times nursery growers, they're not familiar with those pests. They're not thinking about pest control. It's November. What? How to do an application? Yeah, you do. So there are all different exceptions to this. And there's some plants here, and this is a list I should probably change as well. I don't recommend these, all of them, for, of course. Some of them are considered to be invasive, but generally they're relatively less pest prone. And so when you see them on a landscape, it's not that you ignore them, because they still can be pests, but don't necessarily focus on them. They're not considered to be key plants that you know they're going to have good chance they'll be having problems. And so just be aware of that. So you can maybe save time by not spending too much time with them. Okay? And then we have key locations, and this is where the problems are typically found. Yeah. No, no. Spotted lanternfly has many. You know, I think that is maybe a host. Their host is really large, and it's actually increasing. I mean, there's some that they really gravitate toward. We get back to the spotted lanternfly. That's okay. You know, of course, tree of heaven, number one. Black walnut, red maple, willow. Those are some of the key ones, but there are many others. And one thing that spotted lanternfly, since we're talking about this insect, and I know people have a lot of interest in it, rightfully. One thing that they do not feed on, but will lay eggs on, are conifers, like Christmas trees. I work with a few different Christmas tree farms, and they were very concerned when they first started moving in, either last year or this year, at the farms that they had. Do I need to be spraying preventatively for the spotted lanternfly? I said, well, they're not going to feed on your trees, your evergreens. The only thing you need to look out for is when if you do any shipping, or if you have a choose and cut type of an operation, as they load them up on the vehicles, whoever homeowner takes them, look for egg masses, because they can lay eggs on usually going to be on the main stem or the main trunk of the tree. They're not going to lay eggs on the leaves. And oftentimes, if you have a large tree like a red maple, you're looking for the egg masses. You might say, oh, I see nothing on the trunk at all. Well, look at the scaffold branches sometimes, and the underneath of them. Maybe it's 15 feet up in the air. You can see the eggs all laid around underneath the primary scaffold branches. That's a good place to find the eggs. But they will lay eggs many different places. That's a common. I've just seen that with my own relatives who live in Berks County, Pennsylvania, by the way, which is where it was the ground center for where it all began, back in, when they first discovered in 2014, I think. And they didn't have any tree of heaven. They had 3 relatives with different landscapes. None of them had tree of heaven on their landscapes, but they all had. One of them had some gray birch, which were infested, and the other ones had the red maples, and the other one had willows. All of them had infestations. And with the red maple, my sister's home, she says, I go out there, and she was this time of year, when I was visiting them for Thanksgiving. I says, I don't see any egg masses at all. And I said, would you look? I said, oh, on the trunk. That's where they are. Well, they look underneath the main branches. There's a good chance you'll see them there. And sure enough, hundreds of egg masses, because they had severe infestations. Okay, so this is examples of, any of these key locations is where maybe the plants are stressed. So maybe a stressed plant might be more vulnerable to an infestation or disease. They're weakened. They don't have their plant defensive chemicals are less effective, and they're not growing as fast. So they're maybe more vulnerable to attack. And all these would be stressful sites that you need to be aware of, such as this. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad idea, because this was just a driveway. And what they did in the center of the driveway, they made it a planting island. So it became a cul-de-sac. It's like a circular drive. I mean, black macadam is not very attractive, and so they put this planting island in the middle of it. And I kind of thought it was a clever idea. But what they put in there is going to be really prone to problems, undoubtedly. Well, for one thing, they got stone mulch instead of natural mulch, and white marble stones, which may be even worse. But there's going to be a lot of heat here, a lot of harsh sunlight. It's going to be dusty probably with the vehicles moving around. So there's a lot of predators and parasitoids that don't like this kind of a condition. There's things like scales and mites will thrive on a site like this, or things like even the azalea lacebug or rhododendron, even though they may like it well, actually they don't necessarily like shaded. The plants themselves, those plants, azaleas and rhododendrons, they do like it somewhat shaded, or like a filtered shade. They don't want too much shade because then the plants get leggy and they don't flower well. But those cooler, more moisture conditions, those shaded conditions, are be more conducive to the predators and the parasitoids. So you have probably more pests on a site like this because the beneficials are not going to be there. Okay, I mean, imagine things like scales and mites and so forth will really thrive on this type of a site. Whereas this, as I mentioned, this is a azalea hedge, not necessarily good for the plants because it's too much of a dense shade. Leaves and branches are very leggy, but I wouldn't bother looking too long for things like azalea lacebugs here, because there's going to be a lot of predators located, spiders and lacewings, minute pirate bugs, and creatures like that will keep the lacebugs from building up. As far as monitoring, and this is maybe designed more for commercial operations, and so that's why I can skip through this pretty quick. Well, we have some essential tools, really simplistic, nothing high technology that's necessary. And maybe some of these would be you can carry around with you, on at least a few of them. Let me just go through a few things like the hand lens. And if you're a landscaper, you should, if you're dealing with things like insects or diseases, you want to look for them and their presence. You really need to have a hand lens with you. I like to have a lanyard around my neck, so it's always handy. If my hands are free, I just use it when I need it. And 10x is a general purpose. I like to use 16x for spider mites. 20x I use for area 5 mites, which are very small, about 1/3 the size of the spider mite. So that extra magnification helps you see it. But this is really a valuable tool, probably maybe the most valuable for me. And when you use it, I don't know, Mary will be handing out as far as the certified gardeners, maybe the veteran knows, maybe other veterans here. Does she give out hand lenses? She doesn't. Do you use a stereoscope or when you get samples that? Okay. Well, so I know some county gardener programs, they offer hand lenses, if not to give them out to them or to actually use or borrow them. But this guy's almost doing it right, not quite. If you ever use a hand lens, if you're not experienced, maybe you do what this fellow's doing here. You're not accustomed to using it, and you're kind of doing from a distance. But when you use a hand lens, you need to use it correctly. If you ever see a jeweler's loop, they put that right up against their eye socket, and then they bring the sample in to focus it. So he's just maybe several inches away to being correct. But then you also want to make sure you use your dominant eye, because we usually have a dominant eye. Mine is my left eye. In fact, if I tried to use don't step there, try to use a hand lens with my right eye, I think I could do it. I couldn't focus properly, but my dominant eye is my left. So if you ever want to use one and it doesn't feel comfortable, just stop. Okay. And then you just see stuff like this. Yeah, this is I think it's Colorado blue, something like that. And you got spruce spider mites, you got the webbing, the mites moving around on the webbing. You got this white stuff, could probably be two different things. If you see a lot of white at the base of a stem, for example, it's probably one of two things. the caskins, if there's spider mites there, because like all insects, which of course mites are not insects, but they're just like insects, they do shed their exoskeletons. They grow as they go through their larval and then nymphal stages. As the time goes along, they get bigger and they outgrow the exoskeleton and it restricts them. So they begin to grow a new one and then it splits open the old one and they simply walk out of it. And they leave the old exoskeleton behind and it just usually falls wherever it's there. And so you'll see it's always going to be white in color, these caskins. And then also eggshells, no matter what color the eggs of the insects were, when at least my understanding is when the eggs hatch, they will always, the shells will have a white color to them. So when you see white stuff, it's eggshells, and more than likely it's the caskins, the old exoskeletons that they shed. You got all kinds of stuff there. You miss that without a hand lens. It'd be hard to see that without with only your unaided eye. And then we have action thresholds, and this is something that's very difficult for someone, especially if you're more production oriented in the landscape. Greenhouse growers, they can use thresholds very nicely, okay, when they monitor for their pests. Landscapers, it's a little more difficult. There are attempts that have been made to put numbers on them, shown here. You're not going to have a landscaper spend much time counting. It's just too time consuming for them to do that. But there's some guidelines that can be done. There's a handful of them that you can certainly use. For example, bagworms. This is, I think, was designed for a threshold for arborvitaes, like a more columnar type shape. It was done for the nurseries. But they indicated that you can tolerate one bagworm feeding per linear foot if you have a columnar type of things like an arborvitae or juniper or something like that. And so if it's 10 foot tall, according to these thresholds that were listed here by this particular researcher, it can tolerate 10 bagworms without providing unacceptable cosmetic damage to the plant. Okay. And so another one that is often used is spider mites. Okay, use of beating trays. A very high-tech piece of equipment. You got a white piece of paper, maybe on a clipboard, and you go maybe underneath a branch where you suspect perhaps it doesn't have to be spider mites, it could be other types of insects as well. And you just wrap it onto the white 9 by 11 piece of white paper and just see what comes off. And you can do this quickly, do it multiple times, not just do once and that's it, and get an idea of what's present there. With spider mites, you do it, and if you start seeing, well, first of all, you do wrapping on, get your accretions out and see what comes off. And then wait just a few seconds if you're looking for spider mites, and then invert the tray. Get all the plant debris, debris actually just falls off. Then go back up with it again. And oftentimes, if there are mites there, that's all you will see, because the mites were able to hang on. And so they just start moving around like little pepper grains. And sometimes you'll see something about the same size that moves 3, 4, 5 times faster. And those are the predaceous mites, predator mites. And that's that ratio of 10 to 1 that I mentioned before. And you can get a good idea by doing that. So I don't know if I have, let me skip through this. I guess I don't have it. Anyway, so this is kind of interesting to know. If you're ever going to be involved with, I don't know if anyone will be doing these beating trays, do it on your home landscape, it's fun. See what comes off, and if you see the spider mites, then this is the fun part. You can do what's called a streak test. Just do a blood smear. Smear the mites across the paper. And if they have kind of a greenish tinge to it, the color, it was a pest mite. It was something that was feeding on the chlorophyll. If it has a little bit of a reddish color hint to it, that was a predator mite. They weren't feeding on chlorophyll. They were feeding on the mites, the spider mites, the pest mites. And that has kind of a reddish. street to it. And so you can kind of get a ratio. And if it's 10 to 1 or less, that's a good ratio. Boy, you got a lot of predaceous mites on there, and maybe you don't have to do any treatment. If there's no symptoms on the plant, why treat? You got a lot of beneficials present. So that's a quick, easy way to determine. So when we do monitoring, we look for things like symptoms and signs. Okay, symptoms we notice as you're monitoring, and you can do this at your own home landscape. And probably you do. If you scan and look around to see if anything's going on that doesn't look quite right, plants have enough discoloration to them, or they seem to be distorted or not growing properly. You just take a look. Those would be symptoms that the plant is expressing that things are not quite growing properly. Something's wrong. And so you look more closely to see if you can find the causal agent. Now, what's the reason for the plants looking the way they are? That's not natural. And that would be the sign, if you find something. It doesn't have to be an insect. In fact, a good example would be, I think most of you are familiar with girdling roots, right? If you look, and what's one of the more notorious trees in our landscapes that are prone to have girdling roots, well, there's a few of them. Norway spruce is one. Zelkova is another one. They're just very prone to have girdling roots. And especially with Norway maples, I think maybe that's a big tree, they get to be large. Maybe you'll start to see some dieback on the crown, and some branches are starting to die back. That would be the symptom. Something's wrong. I mean, is it a disease? Is it insects? Well, maybe you look at the base and you see it has a big girdling root. Maybe it's the girdling root that's causing the dieback. That would be the sign. That's the causal agent. So that's the difference between symptoms and signs. So well, it's a big deal, but you should, trying to do plant diagnostics is difficult enough. You don't want them compounded by using these two terms interchangeably because they have different meanings. So when you're talking about what's the symptom, don't say, well, the symptom was the girdling root. No, the sign was the girdling root. So use your terms correctly. And there's more examples of symptoms that we all are familiar with, things like notching and leaf lining, and stippling is a great symptom, because remember when I told you about the spider mites? Same thing with lace bugs, is they remove the green chlorophyll from the cells. And then even though maybe the insects are feeding on the bottom of the leaves, but still they're removing killing the cells that are exposed to the top. Visually, you can see that something's going on there. They're becoming yellowish, or maybe they eventually turn brown because the cells die. And so those would be stippling that's taking place because of this piercing, sucking mouth parts of these insects and mites that are causing those symptoms. Okay. Chlorosis is just kind of a fancy term for yellowing. You probably heard iron chlorosis. I mean, it's really quite common with things like red maples. So when the pH gets too high, then the iron can't be taken up by the plant, and you start getting a discoloration. But iron's more easily taken up when the pH is low. All right, so let's move along here. These are the signs I think are also pretty self-explanatory. Insects and mites themselves can be signs. We mentioned caskins, frass. Great story. I remember my early years again. Remember the gypsy moths back in the 80s were really, in the 70s as well, were really serious in some sections, and occasionally they come back again. They resurge. We had a resurgence of gypsy moths down south in this area. I think Gloucester County area had some, in certain local areas, they had a resurgence. It was on the outskirts of the Pine Barrens, I believe, some severe gypsy moths. Also, Cape May County, I think, had a population of gypsy moths. So they do resurge occasionally. Normally, they're nowhere near what they used to be, 40 years ago. They were really serious. It caused a lot of defoliation. But I recall one time where, this is in the early 80s, I was doing an application for a homeowner, big, huge oak trees, And I think at the time we were probably spraying carbaryl, which is 7, still is used today. But I don't think you have too many applicators doing what we did with this before. We were spraying with these big, heavy spray guns, almost rifles. We had to really get suited up and have protective shields. And we had 2 hydraulic pumps, 1,000 pounds per square inch in tandem working. We were able to shoot the thing like a fire hose. We'd shoot it like a 75 feet up in the air. It was really, I felt like I was a firefighter. And we would shoot, and this is 7. This is an insecticide. We're spraying this in residential neighborhoods, and the wind would catch it and blow across the landscape. So it was amazing. We were able to do that and get away with it. But I remember, not to carry on with that, but I remember one time, a woman, after I had actually first arrived, I hadn't done the application yet, and she says, "Oh yes, it's really severe, the caterpillars. They got all this stuff, the stuff on the sidewalks in the driveway." I said, that's frass, that's their excrement. And oh, she didn't even know that. I didn't make her day. And then I made it even worse. She said, yeah, at night, I can go outside, I can kind of look up underneath the canopy of the oak trees, and I can hear the gypsy moths chewing. And I said to her, I shouldn't have said this. Well, no, you're not hearing them chewing. You're hearing the excrement falling onto the leaves. And so I don't think she went outside and looked up anymore underneath the tree. But that's one of those things that just memory sticks with you. Yeah, boy, when I saw her reaction, I said, no, I shouldn't have said that. So these are all signs. The eggshells we've talked about, eggs are signs. So all these are signs. And it's either insects or the disease, like the fungal case. We got mycelia, fruiting bodies from fungi, and nematodes. And these are all different types of foliar nematodes that feed inside the leaves of plants. So these are all potential signs, the causal agents of plant damage. As far as bagworms, just showing you symptoms at the tops of the trees. This is an interesting insect as well. Bagworms have a behavior where there's only one generation, and they feed from around June or beginning of June, late May even, all the way into sometimes September. And they're quite large as they get later into the season, into the late summer. But initially, in that fall period, when the male and female are getting close to pupating and becoming adults, the female will climb to the tops of the trees they're feeding on. In this case, it appears to be an arborvitae, or I think it is. And they get to the top. And the reason they do that is because when the eggs hatch, a large percentage of them, at least 50%, sometimes more, will weave silk. Now, the little tiny caterpillars, they'll weave silk and they'll let the wind catch them. They just take a leap of faith and they just blow with the wind. And they can blow for hundreds and hundreds of yards, depending on how high the elevation is. So that's why the female wants to get up higher. So those who are going to be doing this, catching the wind, they can maybe blow further distances, have a higher chance for survival. At least that's the theory. And so that's why when they don't all leave like that, though some of them stick behind and they feed. And why do they feed at the top? Because that's where they hatched. So that's the little tiny caterpillars start feeding at the top first. So when you look for bagworms on evergreens, look at the top of the trees to see if you got damage taking place. And so that also means that if it's a smaller tree, try to make sure you get the ones that are higher up. Maybe you can use a ladder if it's not too big of a tree, and you simply remove the bags, because the ones that are at the top would probably be mostly females. And so that's a good thing to remember. And that's the bagworm caterpillar. Pretty late in the year, that would be September. Big fat sassy female. I took a photograph of. Okay, I'm going to move around here. I've already kind of talked about some of this. I don't have time because I've been messing around, getting diverted. I do it myself. So I'm not going to talk about growing degree days. I don't know, Mary, if this is something you really wanted me to talk on. Because I want to certainly get time for some of the backyard beneficials,
Yeah.
make sure they know what they look like. Growing degree days is a concept that takes a little bit of time to explain, but just the fact that we all know that insects and plants, they require certain temperature requirements. It's an accumulation of heat units, is what it's called. And as the season progresses, as it gets warmer, the plants and the insects will develop and grow faster. And they produce additional generations if they're capable of doing that. There are species that have multiple generations. If it gets warmer enough, instead of maybe having 2 generations a year, perhaps they can fit in a 3rd generation. That's the concern with the spotted. I gotta get back to the spotted lanternfly. The concern is right now there's only 1 generation a year with them. The concern is that even though it hasn't been documented, that perhaps it has the capability when the temperatures are warm enough to produce a 2nd generation. That's all we need. And so anyway, so maybe they can, with time, because you don't really see them much further south than Georgia. It's about as far because they need the eggs. They need to be chilled. And if it's too warm, then they don't have that chilling, and they don't hatch out properly. So you don't see them down into too far into Florida at all. Maybe Georgia is about the furthest you see them. The eggs will be able to be chilled enough that it can cause, allow them to hatch. So anyway, that's an important part about the temperature and insects. And so just showing you here as temperature increase, the growth rate increases as well, up to a point, about 110 degrees or so, 120 degrees. Almost the vast majority of insects can't tolerate those types of temperature and they just crash. But greenhouse growers, some of them only grow plants in the spring and the fall. And there's a period of time in the summer, maybe only several weeks, where they empty the greenhouse out and they close it up as tight as they can. They just let it cook. If you ever go in a greenhouse in the middle of July that's been all closed up, it could be 130 degrees in there. It could be lethal within a matter of not too much time. And so it's not a place to go into. But that will kill just about any insect. It might as well. Okay. All right. I kind of move around here. New Jersey is only a diverse climate. And you go from, what is this, Sussex County, way up in the northwest, down here to Cape May County. The difference in there, I don't know, like 160 miles, 150 miles, but the climate difference is really quite remarkably different. Where you could have some insects, if you're further south, developing like 3 weeks earlier than we would have the same insect species way up north here. So that's another thing. Keep going back to the spotted lanternfly, because this is the key insect right now. So I don't mind continuing to speak about it because I think it's important. Another reason why they won't go up too far north is because even though their eggs can survive very cold temperatures, minus 5 degrees or even a bit more, even for short periods of time, for even a week or 2, they can survive that temperature. So in New Jersey, we're not going to get cold enough to kill the eggs. But the reason why they're not going to go, there's a few reasons. One of them is they have suitable plant hosts to feed on this. That's a factor. But as you get further and further north, their development rate, because this is a long-lived insect, and for 1 generation, it can go from mid-May all the way into December potentially with the egg hatch and the nymphs, and then the adults. And so if it gets too late, if it's too cool and it doesn't have enough time to go through its life cycle, that's another reason why it won't go too far north. So as far as I don't know if it's even capable of going up into, say, Maine, because of the fact that it would be not enough time for them to complete their life cycle. So I'm not sure how that will get. I think they are in Massachusetts though, the spotted lanternfly. And that's about the furthest north that I'm aware of. They're not up in Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine yet. And they're certainly not up in the Adirondack mountain areas. They would be certainly suitable plant hosts up there. So anyway, okay. So just showing you the diversity of our state, even though we're not not a very big state. I think like maybe 3-4 states that are smaller than New Jersey. We're one of the smallest. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about these numbers because it's too much time. And you can even use what we call plant physiological indicators to help time when certain insect pests will be active based on looking at plants and their flowers or maybe their leaf development or things like development of their seeds, like maple seeds, the samara seeds. You can time when they come out. You know that certain insects is going to become active as well. And so you can use what we call these phenological indicators. This is the one that, I don't know, are there fly fishermen here? Ever, maybe I hope I'm right about this. I'm not a fly fisherman. I think I'd enjoy it, but I'm not. You're familiar with the shad blow serviceberry, which is an amelanchier? Well, according to fly fishermen, when the shad blow serviceberry blooms, the shad will rise to a fly, which I guess means that the water temperature, or I'm not quite sure what entices the shadfish to start to feed, but they go up higher and they start feeding at that time. So at a certain time of the year, I don't know if it's actually temperature based or not for them, but that's one thing that's done. So they know that they see the shad blow serviceberry in bloom, we can go out and do some fly fishing. Food source, I'm sure as well, but it seems to correlate or coincide with the bloom of the shad blow service. Just a coincidence, but they can use that as a phenological indicator. So another one is the fact that oak leaves. When the settlers first came over from England, they didn't have corn, maize over in Europe. It was grown here, of course, by our American Indians. And so when the settlers first came over, they spoke to the Native Americans and asked, and they were told, because they didn't understand, when's a good time to plant this maize, this new crop that they found. And apparently they were told by the Indians that, well, I don't even know what species of tree it was, but when the leaf of an oak species, whatever it is, when the leaves reach the size of a squirrel's ear, then the soils are going to be warm enough to promote the germination of the seed for maize. That's the same thing as maybe if you're turf managers, the forsythia one. Yeah, I think with that, it's around the mid-bloom of forsythia, then that means that the crabgrass germination will begin to progress, and you need to have put down your pre-emergent herbicides by that time. Same thing. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds of these things. There's actually been a book that's written that contains all these different examples of how the phenological indicators coincide with certain insect development and so forth. So it's pretty interesting. So yeah, it's time to plant corn when these are the size of I don't even know what's the size of a squirrel's ear. I guess they knew because they looked at squirrels. They probably eat squirrels all the time. And there's the one that we talked about before, the forsythia in mid-bloom. It's time to put down your pre-emergent. Okay, so you're familiar with that, and so we use this to these. I didn't go growing to 3 days, and so you don't really understand what I mean by that, unless you're familiar with it. But it gives you better timing. We know when certain pests are going to be active, better control. Simply use less pesticide. It just enhances your ability to monitor too. Using these phenological indicators or growing degree days, it tells you when to start looking for certain things. It also increases your efficiency of your scouting. So you're not going to waste time looking for something that's not going to be there yet. So that's the whole idea with this.
Steve, what was the name of the book you mentioned?
Yeah, that book is called Coincide. And I believe it's out of print.
Oh.
I do have a copy of it. It's available, Mary, for a small fee. Actually, the agent in Cumberland County, he asked me if he could borrow it. Because it's a book that contains, I don't know how many, probably well over 1,000 of these phenological indicators, as well as growing degree days they have too. But it's not an
Sorry, we missed it.
Not
What is the name of the book?
interesting book to look at because there's no photographs. It's just data, just numbers and plant development times and different growth and flowers and so forth, leaves. Anyway, yeah, it's Coincide. You might probably read it on the. It'll probably come up, but I'm sure it says it's out of print. Coincide. Is the name? I forget the name of the author. Might be Orton, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, well, this is what I have time to get to, and what is my time here? 20 minutes, that's perfect. This is how long it takes me to give this section, 20 minutes. And we finally end this nonsense. And so IPM does use natural control agents. And the fact that this was kind of, I think, a question that was alluded to earlier. I mean, in a perfect world, you can see this beneficial pest equilibrium has been established where it never gets above the action threshold. Shown there at the black line at the top. Well, that's not reality. I mean, there's going to be situations when the pests are going to be more competitive compared to the beneficials. There's some years where the beneficials are just simply less in their population for whatever reason. Oftentimes it's environmental that reduces their population at a certain area, or the fact that environmental conditions will favor the development of the pests to develop at a faster rate. So there will be time when this is more realistic as shown here, where this will take place. So that means we still have to do interventions of some kind to help prevent the thresholds from being exceeded. So we just can't let nature take care of itself because sometimes it's not capable of doing it. So we use parasitoids and pathogens, and they're all very beneficial to help reduce the pests and keep them at a level that's maybe more satisfactory. Predators are typically the most familiar with are predators. They're typically maybe a little bit larger than their prey, and they will feed on many different prey species. Now, for example, even though praying mantids are a good example of an excellent predator, in the landscape, they're overrated, for one thing. They're not going to feed on a lot of the pests that we have in our landscapes. And they're rather indiscriminate on what they feed. They feed what they can catch, or they often will ambush. And so they'll go after things we don't want them to. They'll feed lady beetles. They'll feed on honeybees. They'll feed on butterflies. So there's not a lot of insects that we appreciate, but there are a few of them. Maybe dragonflies is another one, but I don't know if they would. Yeah, they would take care of a dragonfly. Praying mantids are really remarkable, but they do kill them rapidly. And if we have the ones we have in our backyard that we all should know, we know this one, of course. I've already talked about it, just mentioned it. And of course, this is the egg mass of what? Praying mantis. Yes, you see them right now look like this, and then for them to hatch, they kind of look like this. And out of this one, I actually was able to put them in a container. I provided air for them, and they hatched out. And I was able to do a count. This exactly had 100 praying mantids that came out of that egg mass. Exactly. And they're pretty quick little stage, this small stage. And I had to keep pushing the ones I had already counted. And I got to 100. That's what I counted. So anyway, but you know, the thing is with praying mantids is that they are pretty territorial. And they don't allow many of their own kind to be near them. And you probably have heard the story, you know, a male has got to be very careful when he approaches a female to mate, because oftentimes if she can catch him, she'll eat him after mating. And so oftentimes he's able to get away, but if you have them in a, like a herbarium, I guess it's a herbarium, you know, he doesn't have a limited place to move. She'll end up beating him. She'll catch him eventually. So, yeah. And as I asked, is that a useful predator? No, not really. It's not that I would do anything about them. They are an excellent predator, but they're just not that taking care of a lot of our insect pests. They have other interests. There's one like very common is that the spiders are amazing. I'm sure some of you have noticed earlier in the morning when there's dew on the grass, you go outside and you can see
They can't
all the
hear me.
webbing on the turf.
Last night, in the middle of the night, the friggin'
Spiders in your turf,
smoke alarm.
unless you're applying a
Sure,
broad
yeah.
spectrum
Excuse that, battery.
that might kill them all off.
Right there.
Spiders are certainly an outstanding predator, all different species of spiders. And the one that we know best, of course, are the lady beetles or ladybugs. And this is the eggs of a lady beetle. They often, about a dozen of them are laid all grouped together like bowling pin. And this is the larva or the immature stage of a lady beetle. Maybe less recognized. You know, the beetle itself, the adult stage, but oftentimes with beneficials, we have less recognition of the immature stages. And this is the one that, especially in the larval stages, that ratio of 50 to 1, 50 to 1, this guy will take care of 50 aphids for us. And they have a pupation stage that often people get confused about, but that's certainly nothing to worry because this is the ladybird beetle pupation stage. Okay, this is a lady beetle adult that's eyeing this tulip tree scale. You know, the tulip tree scale, it doesn't have a detachable shell like the armored scales, but this beetle and other insects, they don't really want to, it's an exoskeleton it has, it's attached to the scale, so you can't remove it looks like a cover, it's not actually a cover, it's an exoskeleton, but it's really, it has a waxiness to it, and it's not even very tasty to go through it. So what the lady beetle attempts to do is they try to get underneath the scale and pop it off of the branches or the leaves that they're feeding on. So they get on the soft underbelly and they can kill the scale that way. Okay. With the armored scales, by the way, lady beetles will go into the wax and they'll leave big rough tears. Just unlike the parasitoids, little circles. With the lady beetles or lacewings, for example, big rough tears where they go and they can grab the beetle that are underneath.
Someone asked if Asian lady beetles are beneficial.
I think you're talking about the multicolored Asian. They were brought over a few decades ago. They were released in the Gulf State area to try to control peach aphids on the peach trees, and it worked very well. However, the beetles migrated north also, and they are good predators, but the thing is they have a tendency as adults overwinter as adults, and they'll go into homes, attics, crawl spaces. They overwinter, and they could potentially become a major nuisance, I guess. And so there have been attempts to control them with things like black lights and other types of devices. But you know, you hate to destroy them because they are still good predators when they're in the landscape during the season. But just the fact that they become a nuisance during the overwintering period. They need a place like an attic of a house or a crawl space for protection. It's very nice for them. And the trouble is you start disturbing them, start, releasing undesirable juices that have an odor to them. So you've got to be careful how you get rid of them. But this showing you here the yellow egg masses, right there, little clumps like little bowling pins that are yellow. Then they hatch. So the eggshells are there, white in color. See, I was telling the truth there. I wasn't lying. And you got a couple, two, like three of them. There's a lot more than this. There's many eggs there, but three of them are shown in this photograph that are the immature. They'd be the first instars. And I think these have three, I'm not sure about this, 3 or maybe 4 instars. And then they pupate. They have probably 4 instars. They pupate and then they become the adult stage, shown here, already making more of their own kind. And then, well, they pupate first, of course. That's the pupation stage. So when you see this on your leaves of your tree, don't panic. What's this foreign thing? It's a good guy. It's a lady beetle species. And so these are the 4 life stages. It has a complete metamorphosis to it. And I thought, you mentioned this you were talking about mealybugs. This looks like a mealybug, but it's actually a beneficial lady beetle. It's called the Glaucurus, and it mimics the appearance of a mealybug. The reason they do this, it was going after like some tulip tree scales there. The reason they do this is because ants want to protect the food that honeydew producers create. Now, things like aphids, mealybugs, actually mealybugs are a type of species of scales. Things like, soft scales, white flies produce honeydew. And of course, we all know the spotted lanternfly. Does that produce honeydew? You better believe it. More than any of the others I just mentioned. That's a prodigious honeydew producer. But anyway, the ants like that free energy source because the honeydew contains a lot of carbohydrates and sugars, as these things like, in this case, the tulip trees or the aphids or what have you, these honeydew, these phloem feeders, they don't need all that extra, sugary carbohydrates, only need some of it, but they have to suck up a lot of it because they need to get the protein, which is not, the phloem is not necessarily protein rich. And so to get enough protein, they have to suck up a lot of it. So they just get rid of the extra carbohydrates they don't need. And this is just a free energy source for things like, like ants. Yeah, and they'll spend a lot of time protecting them against predators. So what these, they'll knock off the ants will knock off the lady beetles and the lacewings. They'll attack the parasitoids that come in and try to lay the eggs. They'll go get them because they're trying to protect their food source. So what the particular species of lady beetle has done to help avoid being attacked by ants, they'll mimic the appearance of mealybugs. And they do look like mealybugs. And apparently the ants are confused by them. And I've actually seen this. And I'll see an ant and they'll kind of investigate the mealybug. In fact, they'll kind of look to see if there's honeydew coming out at the back end of it. But they chomp down on it thinking that it's a lady beetle. And so they don't think of it as a threat to their food source. So that's why they mimic the appearance of a mealybug. To the ant bug, there's a food source. So it's pretty interesting how these things evolve. And there it is. It's the larval immature stage. Okay. And I was getting close, but this is a lacewing adult. Beautiful insects. Got the golden eye right here. I think it went to Notre Dame. But they fly as an adult. They're not particularly very good predators. The adults will feed on some aphids. They're called aphid lions because of this stage. This guy here. These immature stages of lacewings, they're psychopaths. They are the psychopath of the insect world. They kill for sport. They'll kill more than they can eat. Even though they don't even plan to eat some of the things, they just kill it. They don't have room, maybe they're full, they can't eat anymore, but they still just kill. That's what they do. And this is showing you, they have these two mouth part type projections shaped like the old, maybe it's familiar with the old ice tongs, shaped, and you pick up the ice. Well, these things are shaped like that, but they're hollow and they're sharp, and they can impale them inside of like a soft body of an aphid, and they release some enzymes to help dissolve the interior portions of the aphid's body, and they just suck it all out. And you can watch them do this. You can watch them suck the aphid dry, and just shrinks right before your eyes. So they really are something. So, okay. And you can watch, I don't know of any other insect that has this. You can see their eggs, and they're put on this little tiny, these stalks, these little hair-like stalks. And they do this to protect against predators, and also against the first ones that hatch out. The other ones that have not hatched, the brothers and sisters that have yet, they're still in the egg stage. If it was readily available to the ones that hatch out first, they're cannibals. They'll just start eating. And so the female good mother, she realizes this, so she puts her eggs on little stalks so that they're more protected against the ones that first hatch out, and against other predators of it. Well, you can see down below, you can see some aphids there. This, I believe, is the bottom of the leaf. So this slide, although I have seen the eggs sticking straight up, sometimes they'll stick straight down as well. I think this slide was inverted. I think. So I didn't take this one. So maybe this is the last one I'll talk about. It's one that it's called the hoverfly or the surfeit fly. Really underrated. Praying mantids are overrated. This guy is underrated. We don't appreciate it at all. It's a larva. The adult's not a predator whatsoever. They do lay eggs. They are a bit of a pollinator, but they will lay eggs where they know that there's going to be enough food, progeny, when they lay their eggs. And so they hatch out, and they are maggots. And the one shown here, it's a surfeit or flower fly. They're different names. The scientific name is surfeit fly. That's the genus. They're called hoverflies because the adults will hover in the air like this, like a little miniature honeybee or hummingbird, and also flower fly larvae is what they're called as well. But they are, and this is a field of woolly aphids that this maggot is developing in, and apparently they're blind, and as they move around, just kind of methodically meander around, they'll come in contact with an aphid. They have a hook-like mouth part. They'll stick it in, and they lift it up in the air, and they just suck it dry. It's been shown that, at least on short periods of time, they can do about 1 per minute of the aphids. So this is one that we don't usually see unless you look for them, not even aware that they're there. But if you have a sizable aphid population in your landscape, if you look for them, you'll see the surfeit more than likely. Aphids in the landscapes, I think I emphasized this a month ago, they're really a junior varsity pest, only because there's so many predators that go after them. So you don't really want to spend a lot of your time spraying insecticides against aphids, if you can help it. All right, let's see. I know my time is up, right, Mary? What time you got?
11:59.
Oh, we got plenty of time yet. Have you noticed yellow jackets? We know them as a nuisance later in the summer at our Labor Day picnics. They go out for our sugary drinks or potato salads. In the spring, they're great predators. They really are. In fact, I took this photograph. This is when the eastern tank caterpillars were active, and they produced the webbings and the forks of the trees. I was looking at webbing, and I noted all these holes in the webbing. What is that? And then suddenly just as I'm about to take the photograph, it was perfect timing. A yellow jacket comes zooming in into the webbing, dug down into it, grabbed this eastern tent caterpillar that was near the surface, grabbed it, chomped down on it, and took off. And that's what they do, is they kind of wait, see something near the surface of the webbing, the yellow jackets come in, and there's some of the previous areas where they opened it up to get a caterpillar. So they're really very outstanding predators. And one of the reasons why the eastern tent caterpillar is nowhere near the pest, let's say something like a gypsy moth or the spotted lanternfly, because this is a native caterpillar. And native pests are often have evolved with a lot of different types of predators or parasitoids. And so they've established a good equilibrium. It's when we come in and bring something that comes over that we don't have any natural predation against, that's when we become a big pest. In fact, I think it's been, if I get these numbers right, there's only about 2% of our insects that are established here in North America that are considered to be invasive. Only 2%. However, those 2% represent 50% of what we consider to be our major pests that we deal with. That's because we don't have the natural predation that evolved with them. And we try to go over to the continent where they came from and re-release them, but biocontrol takes time. Maybe in 15 years, we will have developed enough of the bringing in predators from other areas, like the thing I all started with the cottony Cushing scale on the citrus groves. We're bringing in a predator that we don't have here, but happens to be present at another location. We can bring that and be beneficial for us. So, all right. So I think I leave that with sometimes I get really lucky with my slides. This is it. I came and I was at a nursery, and these dragonflies are amazing how fast they are. I think for short spurts, they can move like 40 miles an hour. Just zoom, zoom. And to try to get a photograph of them, good luck. But one time I came up to this dragonfly that was on a support of a hoop house at a nursery. And I saw this, and I had my camera ready, so I kind of started approaching it. And I thought for sure it's going to move away. I very slowly moved it closer, closer. And I kind of got excited. So I better take the picture before it flies off. And I was able to get this photograph. I did, kind of crop it and get it blown up a little bit more and still maintain the resolution. But sometimes you get pretty lucky with photographs. Okay, well, thanks for sticking around and listening. And yeah.